Okay, we're live. Uh, Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Derek Slater. I'm on Google's public policy team, and I'm really grateful to be hanging out with you guys today in the Take Action community and talking about surveillance reform. For those who haven't been in the community for very long, we started Google Take Action to really engage internet users and inform them on public policy issues affecting the internet. That's obviously important to Google, but we think it's important to users, everyone around the world too. Obviously what governments do kind of real impacts, both good and bad, on how the internet works and what you get to do with it. Today we're focused on surveillance reform in Washington. That's something we've talked about a lot over the last year and really hopeful about the prospects of in the next 6 months. So we want to talk about what's going on and what we can do together. We're going to take some live questions from some members of the community who were able to show up today and pose some really interesting questions. And we also received a bunch of other questions via email. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I've tried to synthesize them and make sure that they're represented here. So to answer these questions, we've got David Lieber here, who's our senior privacy counsel in DC. He's our boots on the ground in Google's policy shop in DC, engaging with legislators and others to support meaningful surveillance reform. So David, thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you, Derek. It's really great to have this opportunity, and I think a lot of folks who are participating in this hangout are going to have a very large role to play in the outcome of surveillance reform legislation. So this is a really great opportunity on both ends.
Great. Well then, before diving into the participant questions, let's start out by setting the scene a little bit. It's been nearly 2 years since Edward Snowden's shocking revelations began. Can you talk a bit about where we stand today in terms of what's known about U.S. surveillance practices, what's happened in Washington in terms of reform, and what's up next?
Yeah, so I think at a really high level, what we've learned about through the Snowden revelations is that surveillance that has been conducted in a way that is not targeted in many respects. There's been bulk collection of communications metadata. We learned that through the first Snowden revelation with respect to the Verizon order that sought the collection telephony metadata from millions of Verizon customers. And I think that's colored the way that we've sort of perceived surveillance here in the US and the policy prescriptions that necessarily follow from it. So we are still very much focused on the first 2 days of Snowden revelations, the stories that first came out in The Guardian and The Washington Post. And the debate, unfortunately, hasn't matured much beyond that. But that's not to say that the issues that are associated with those first 2 days of revelations are insignificant. They're very important. And they're hopefully things that we are going to be dealing with in the next few months. In terms of what we've seen in Washington, D.C., there really hasn't been much progress on the legislative front. But I also don't want to underestimate or discount the progress that we've made in terms of transparency. Much of that has been engendered by the Snowden revelations, but it's something that we've worked here at Google really hard to promote. And this really occurred even before the initial Snowden revelations. We had engaged for months with the Department of Justice to allow us to say more about the national security letters that we received from the FBI and the Department of Justice. And so that led to an agreement in March of 2013, where for the first time we were allowed to acknowledge receipt of these national security letters and publish information, albeit in broad ranges, about the nature and scope of those national security letters. In the immediate aftermath of the Snowden revelations, one of the things that we felt like it was really important to do, I think in part because some of the reporting around our involvement wasn't entirely accurate, was to sort of set the record straight, to make clear the volume, scope, and type of national security demands that we receive, including those that fall under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And so we did file so some of you may recall, we filed a suit before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in June of 2013, asserting a First Amendment right to say more about the national security demands, including FISA demands that we received. And that led ultimately to an agreement in January of 2014 where we were allowed to say for the first time that we actually get these demands. We weren't allowed to say that before then. And we were allowed to speak in terms of ranges of how many demands that we get and how many users are impacted. And while I think we always have supported transparency for its own sake, I think this is really a situation where transparency can help inform the broader debate. And what I mean by that is if you sort of look behind the numbers, what you can see is that the government, at least vis-a-vis Google, is not necessarily all that interested in communications metadata that we maintain. They are interested in the content of those communications, which falls under a separate sort of legal authority under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And what's interesting about that is that the opposite is true when we're talking about requests for sort of data that pertain to domestic law enforcement. So they're very interested in metadata, in part because it's easier to obtain under U.S. law, and we get less requests on the content side.
Yeah. David, let me ask you one question before you go on, because I think there are two really important terms here that we should define for people or make sure we all understand. One is bulk collection, and the other is metadata. So I think most people's sort of sense of surveillance or the way the government gets access to data is they go and they have one particular target, they get that information with a warrant or some such. So can you give a bit more detail on what's bulk collection and what's metadata? What are the sort of things they're collecting?
Yeah, so thanks for asking those questions in case I'm talking past some of these issues. When we're talking about bulk collection, we're talking about the collection of a large universe of records from a large universe of people, the vast majority of whom are not suspected of wrongdoing or terrorism. That, if you look at the Verizon order, which really sought the collection of communications metadata from each and every single Verizon customer for whom the order pertained to, that is bulk collection in its most starkest sense. When we're talking about metadata and the distinction between metadata and content, and metadata really pertains to data about the communication. So it might be the IP address that's associated with your login. It might be the timestamp on an email, or it could be the length and duration of a telephone call. All the things that really don't count as content, the substance of your email, what you said during your telephone call, all of those things, are metadata, and then the content, of course, is actually what you were saying on the phone, what you're communicating in your email.
So, David, I think that sort of brings us to what's going on later this year. It's a big moment in surveillance reform, or potential moment, when the parts of the USA Patriot Act are set to expire. Some in Congress are pushing for it to be renewed. Can you give a bit more on what's at stake here with the USA Patriot Act, and what does this mean in terms of the broader surveillance landscape?
Yeah, so look, I think that the next few months, they are really a dress rehearsal for a broader and long overdue debate that we're going to have about surveillance reform. The issues that Congress is likely to tackle in the next few months are really amount to a narrow slice of the broader surveillance pie. I alluded before to the fact that we are still sort of dealing with the issues that were broached in the first 2 days of Snowden revelations. And so that's really what the debate right now about Section 215 is about. And for those of you who aren't entirely familiar with it, Section 215 is the authority that the government has relied on for the bulk telephony metadata program. It allows and authorizes the collection of quote-unquote tangible things for international terrorism and clandestine intelligence activities and investigations. One of the things that I think we've sought to emphasize with Congress is that Section 215, while it's set to expire at the end of May, and is a very important, I think, authority to make sure that it is modified and reformed so that the collection is targeted, there are other authorities that are and have been used for the bulk collection of other types of records. So what's referred to as Section 216 or 214, depending on how you're looking at it, was relied upon to collect internet metadata in bulk. There was a program that existed, and I believe until 2011, it's now defunct, for the collection of internet metadata in bulk. And so we want to make sure that when we're closing off loopholes for potential bulk data collection with respect to metadata, communications metadata, that we're doing so in a complete and comprehensive way, so that there aren't other mechanisms after we've pass this reform that can be utilized in the future to justify bulk surveillance and bulk collection programs. So that's something that we, Google, have been pretty focused on, and we've had some success because the piece of legislation that we're supporting in Congress, the USA Freedom Act, actually does close off additional avenues that could be used for bulk data collection in light of what we've learned as a result of the Snowden revelations. The USA Freedom Act is a, as I mentioned, is a bill that we're supporting. In addition to preventing the bulk collection of communications metadata under various legal authorities, it would allow companies like Google to say more, even more than we are allowed to say currently under this Department of Justice agreement I had mentioned before, more about the nature, scope, and volume of demands that we received, and it would actually also impose new accountability mechanisms and oversight mechanisms to ensure that bulk data collection is not happening, and to the extent that it is, it will be sort of published and available as a result of decisions from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that will be released.
Great. Okay, so come June, this section of the Patriot Act is set to expire, but hopeful that the USA Freedom Act can come in and supply reform, or the act simply expires itself. So with that as sort of background, I want to now turn it over to participants from the rest of the Take Action community. So Joe Gagnon, let's start with you. Why don't you ask your question for David?
Thank you. David, thanks for talking to us today. My question is about Executive Order 12333. While ending Patriot Act Section 215 would be an excellent first step towards meaningful surveillance reform, can Executive Order 12333 also be addressed in Congress? It's how the NSA has justified its bulk collection of data as it traveled between Yahoo and Google's internal servers, and White House whistleblower John Tye has argued that it's an even more dangerous authorization of mass surveillance practices.
Yes, that's a great question, and I mentioned before that what we're doing in the next few months is really a dress rehearsal for broader surveillance reform debate and discussion that we ought to have, and this is clearly one of those legal authorities where there is not a lot of insight. There's not a lot of insight other than the insight we've received from John Napier Tye, as you mentioned, and it's not an authority, if you will, that Congress has exercised a lot of oversight over. In fact, Congress has conceded as much. And for those of you who aren't familiar, what is Executive Order 12333? It's a Reagan-era order from 1981 that authorizes signals intelligence collection overseas. And if you think about it, 1981, of course, was before the advent of the internet. So in 1981, you could have reasonable confidence that when you were collecting data overseas, that it was going to belong to non-U.S. persons, and that's not the case anymore as a result of sort of the arrival of cloud computing and the way that sort of internet infrastructure works. It may very well be that the communications of U.S. persons are stored abroad. You can't have the type of confidence that you used to. That merely because you're engaging in signals collection overseas, that necessarily is going to pertain to non-U.S. persons. There's been some interesting debate. It hasn't really matured to the point where Congress is seriously considering it, but there's sort of questions about whether Congress even has the authority under the Constitution to regulate signals intelligence collection. Questions about whether that's really something that exclusively belongs to the executive branch and whether Congress can regulate that. But I think there are examples in the past where Congress has done that. And there are real issues here too. It's interesting. Executive Order 12333, I think it acknowledges and envisions that there may be situations where the collection of U.S. persons' data is incidentally collected, meaning it's not targeted, but it happens to be swept up in collection that otherwise targets non-U.S. persons. It's our belief that when that happens, and particularly in light of the fact that because of the way that cloud computing infrastructure works, there's a much higher likelihood that happens, and it does happen, that we can't just sort of push to the side the Fourth Amendment issues associated with gathering Americans' communications data, and that includes content. That's a big distinction between Section 215 and 12333. 12333 is absolutely about the collection of metadata and content. So there are important Fourth Amendment issues associated with that. I don't know that the right solution is simply collecting it all and burying your head in the sand in terms of the data the data that's collected being data that is potentially protected by the Fourth Amendment. So we are going to have a very robust debate about that. We haven't gotten to the point, I think, where Congress is willing to engage at that level. In a lot of ways, the debate that we'll be having over the next 3 months is going to be an important harbinger for whether we can have that debate and whether we can enact meaningful reforms. And if I had a message to deliver to those of you who are watching today, if you look at the internet policy reforms that have been undertaken in the past few years, whether it's the rejection of SOPA by Congress or even more recently with the enactment of net neutrality rules, candidly, as much as I'd like to think that I'm a really good advocate and make convincing arguments here in Washington, D.C., at the end of the day, what made the difference was activism by folks who are in the netroots, engaging with members of Congress or engaging with FCC officials and making your voice known in ways that I think is just much more powerful and resonates much more with people than folks like me. So I would just encourage you not to underestimate your ability to make a difference in the upcoming debate.
Very good, and we'll certainly have more to say about that as the spring rolls along and figure out ways where we can all work together on that. Now turning to Elise, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, David. Thanks for being here and answering our questions today. I know a lot of the discussion around the U.S. Patriot Act tends to be about Americans and privacy issues for that particular country. But how has the U.S. Patriot Act affected not just that, but also the worldwide internet community in terms of economic impact and also technological advancement?
That's a great question. It's interesting. Since the Snowden revelations, I've been asked quite a bit about the economic impact that this has had, and there are lots of estimates about how this is going to impact internet commerce and activity. In the next few years, the estimates have ranged from tens of billions of dollars to 100 or 150 billion dollars. I try to tell people when I'm talking about this issue that we should look that it's a little bit myopic to focus, for example, on lost contracts or lost sales. There is a broader currency that's less quantifiable than simply sort of dollars and cents. And what I mean by that is that trust is really the lifeblood of internet commerce and activity. And once it's squandered, it's very difficult to regain. And folks sometimes look at me as somebody who works for Google and says, well, David, you worked for Google. So they roll their eyes at the notion that this could actually be some existential threat for us or other internet companies that are similar to us. But I often remind people to look back 10 years ago in 2005 when it was MySpace's world and we were all just living in it. At the time, in 2005, there was no notion that MySpace could sort of be knocked off of its perch as the king of the hill of internet giants. But that's why we take this issue, I think, really seriously, because at the end of the day, if people don't trust us, they won't use our products and services. We're not making a new car next year. Well, actually, we are. But we're not making different products and services that come out on a quarterly basis or every year. So I think that just underscores the fact that this is a really important issue for us to get right. And I think there are other governments and folks who live abroad who rightly now are skeptical of U.S. companies as a result of the fact that we are bound by U.S. law. We do have to compel with demands for user data. Of course, we always push back when those demands are unreasonable, when they're overbroad, when they don't comport with the law. But I think this issue of trust really underlies a lot of the concerns that we have, notwithstanding the fact that there are going to be some real economic impact here. And it will affect companies beyond just Google. One example, I think it was last year, where there was a contract that was up between Saab and Boeing in the United States, non-internet companies, a $4 billion contract that was given to Saab, and Brazil wasn't shy about saying that the reason they did that was because of concerns that Boeing would be sharing information with the NSA and other intelligence agencies. So these issues can be pretty stark in areas that actually don't even necessarily have a nexus to the internet or internet companies.
Before moving on to Jose, I want to take one question from the Q&A app here that we got live from the viewers. This is from Alex Matthews. What gives you the confidence, David, that this Congress is more likely to achieve cloture and success in passing USA Freedom than the last Congress, given that some surveillance reformers were lukewarm on USA Freedom last time around? What will excite them, or what will drive enactment this time around? What do you think is going to be different?
Yeah, I think that the pending deadline at the end of May is something that forces action. It may have been easier last year to defer the debate until this year. That can't happen. Something has to be done by the end of May, and I think there are reasons for optimism, particularly in the House of Representatives. Last year, there was actually a version of the USA Freedom Act that we supported that passed the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees unanimously that would have prevented the bulk collection of communications metadata under various authorities, that would have provided more transparency, that would have codified and included accountability and oversight mechanisms. You know, we did oppose that bill when it went to the floor because we felt like, you know, in between consideration in the committee and before the full House considered it, there were changes that were made that we couldn't support. It did leave open the door to bulky type collection. But the composition of the House is very similar, and they're going to have a lot to say about the outcome of the debate. In the Senate, we had 58 votes. You know, in most, out of 100, most situations, that would rule the day. It doesn't in the Senate as a result of rules. The question, I think, alluded to cloture. So in the U.S. Senate, you often need 60 votes just to proceed to a debate on an underlying issue or bill. You know, some of those no votes were not necessarily related to substance, but related to process. So look, I think our goal is to push through the barriers that exist. There's no question but that it's an uphill battle, but I think there's also reason for optimism. And again, I'll just reiterate, the more that members of Congress and senators are hearing from regular people, they do take stock of those telephone calls, of those emails, of those social media contacts. As I said, don't underestimate the ability to make an impact here through grassroots activism, through netroots activism.
Great. Okay, Jose, let's turn to you.
Hello, Derek. It's a pleasure to meet you. My question is, how has Google helped the Tor community and/or other anonymity networks, and have these networks helped Google provide better privacy for its users?
Yeah, so one of the things I know that we tried to do in terms of making a direct impact and doing so concretely is through Google's Summer of Code. So we provide stipends for students to essentially write code for projects that they're interested in, and we've worked with the Tor project, I think, since 2007, and are going to do so again this summer in 2015. So we're interested in particular on the engineering side in providing resources so that communities like Tor can exist, and that people particularly who have a need to communicate anonymously and with sort of additional layer of security can do so. One of the other things I think that we worked on that we inaugurated last year, I think in July 2014, was something called Project Zero, which is, you know, an initiative that includes a lot of sort of world-renowned security experts that are looking to identify zero-day exploits. And you know, they're aptly named 0 days because security research and experts have had 0 days to fix these vulnerabilities and flaws. They exist, they're out there, and there's no known fix. And so we have a team of folks who are identifying these flaws right now, trying to do it in the most responsible way, notifying purveyors of security, of software and hardware when these vulnerabilities exist, giving them 90 days to address the vulnerability, and then we publish it, in part because we don't want these vulnerabilities to be sort of existing out there and leaving our users and others vulnerable and susceptible to potential harms. I do want to address really quickly too that there's another aspect to this issue regarding security flaws, and that's on the government side. we believe the government needs to have the same sort of bias toward disclosure that we do when we identify security vulnerabilities. There have been concerns, and we've seen this emerge from the Snowden revelations, that in some instances, governmental entities, intelligence agencies will stockpile these vulnerabilities and rather than disclose them so that the broader universe of internet users can be protected, they will use them for surveillance purposes because there is no known fix. There is no known way to protect oneself. And we've seen some recommendations made from the president's, I think it was a review group on intelligence, communications, and technology, that there ought to be a clear bias toward disclosure. And I think the Obama administration largely subscribes to that view. But there needs to be a little bit more teeth behind that. It needs to be more than a policy. And we're having a current debate here in Washington, D.C. about cybersecurity legislation and information sharing legislation. One of the aspects, one of the notable things that I think is conspicuously absent from that debate is the discussion about vulnerabilities, how we address these security flaws, in what circumstances can governmental entities and/or intelligence agencies keep these security vulnerabilities secret and not disclose them to the broader internet community. So I'm hopeful that's something that we're going to take up at some point, because it's really, I think, at the core of concerns around cybersecurity.
Great. And now another question we got in via email from several people. There's been a real debate going on in Washington about encryption. That is the ability to sort of secure the contents of your email, your other communications, and your devices. And folks like the FBI suggesting that companies ought to have a backdoor for law enforcement, so that you can, have some weakness in the encryption to be able to break it if you're law enforcement. Does Google have a public position against compelled inclusion of deliberate security weaknesses or other compelled backdoors? And what is that position?
Yeah, so we do feel pretty strongly that these sorts of backdoors should not be required. There should be no requirement that we build those into our products and services. And we had an opportunity last year when this issue came up, as other pieces of surveillance reform legislation were being considered. And I think we were the only major internet company to join in civil liberties groups and smaller companies in support of an amendment to the Department of Defense appropriations bill, and we signed a letter to this effect. Basically, the amendment would have prohibited the use of appropriated funds to request or require companies to build backdoors into their products. It also would have done something else which we think is pretty important, which is to close what's called the backdoor search loophole. I was mentioning before that under Executive Order 12333, there is something called incidental collection. The same sort of issue has surfaced with what's called Section 702, and that deals with the collection of content. It is what the PRISM program is really all about. And that particular section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act prohibits intelligence agencies from intentionally targeting U.S. persons and collecting foreign intelligence information, but it doesn't prohibit the use of that information when it's incidentally collected. And so the notion is that once collected, it is lawful to be used in the same way that collection of information about non-U.S. persons might be used. And it sort of puts to the side some of the important Fourth Amendment issues. And Senator Wyden, in particular here, has been a vocal advocate for closing that loophole, and we supported it as well as part of that amendment, and we'll be supportive of that issue going forward too.
Great. So simply put, Google's position on compelled backdoors, they're bad. Good. Finally, one more that I think it's important, for us to address, and it comes up a lot for us at Google, is how and why is government surveillance different than corporations collecting data or Google collecting data, or is it different? If so, what do you see as the differences, David, and why should we draw a distinction between these things?
Yeah, no, look, I think this issue's come up a lot since the initial Snowden revelations. I think particularly among those who I think defending the intelligence agency's collection, that if you look at what Google is doing or Facebook or other companies, it's the exact same thing. In fact, it's worse. I think that really conflates two separate and distinct issues here. Not to sound flippant about it, but Nobody opts into government surveillance and nobody gets to opt out. I think there are clear differences between what the intelligence agencies are doing and what we're doing, and part of it is just the nature of the operation, the undertaking. The intelligence agencies have very difficult jobs, and nobody here, I think, questions their motives, but it's not transparent, and it's designed not to be transparent. There is no choice. There's rarely an ability to find out whether you're actually subject to surveillance. So that stands in stark contrast in my mind to what we do. We try to be as transparent as we can. We give our users choices. We allow them to exercise control. And people will say that we could do better, and we're always looking for ways to do better in terms of giving people controls over the information that we collect and use about that. But it's apples and oranges when we're talking about what Google does versus what the intelligence community does.
Great. Okay, we're about at time, so thanks, David, and all of you for joining in the discussion. Look, the expiration is one of the key moments coming up in the next few months, as David said, is this expiration of key parts of the Patriot Act at the beginning of June, and we'll be in touch as the discussion in DC heats up about what we can do together. One last question that we didn't get to: what can a non-U.S. citizen do to help fight against this excessive surveillance? I think the voices of everybody around the world are really important, not just people in the U.S. or U.S. citizens, and to address this issue really holistically and globally. So we'll be in touch. In the meantime, you can start by spreading the word to others in your social networks and so on. If you visit takeaction.withgoogle.com/2015, it's an easy way for you to spread the word about how surveillance reform is going to be on the table, and we'll be coming back to you guys in the coming months so that we can take action. Thank you guys, and thanks David again for joining us.